What if I told you that somewhere in the hills of rural Vermont, there's a patch of earth that locals refuse to walk on after sunset? What if I told you that this same ground once drove a man so mad that he buried himself alive, convinced that the soil itself was stealing his thoughts? Tonight, we dive into the story of Marcus Thorne, a poet whose obsession with nature led him down a path so dark that even today, nearly 70 years later, his typewriter still sits untouched in his abandoned cabin, and visitors claim they can hear faint whispers rising from the floorboards. This is the story of a man who believed the earth was listening to him. And worse yet, it was talking back. Marcus Thorne arrived in Millbrook Hollow in 1954, a gaunt figure carrying nothing but a leather satchel and an old royal typewriter. The townspeople remember him as polite but distant, with eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. He rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, right at the edge of what locals called the Listening Woods. The cabin sat on a peculiar plot of land. The previous 3 tenants had all left within months, each claiming they heard voices in the walls. But Marcus seemed drawn to the place. He told the landlord, old Samuel Garrett, that the land spoke to him in ways he had never experienced. For the first few months, everything seemed normal. Marcus would spend his mornings writing poetry on his front porch, his afternoons walking through the woods, and his evenings typing furiously by candlelight. The local postmaster, Henry Mills, recalls Marcus mailing out dozens of poems to publishers across the country. His work was good, Mills said, though there was something unsettling about the themes. Marcus wrote about the earth as if it were alive, as if it had consciousness and desire. But then something changed. It started in late autumn when Marcus began visiting the Millbrook General Store at odd hours, always buying the same things: candles, ink, and bags of potting soil. When asked why he needed so much soil, Marcus would only say he was feeding the ground that fed his inspiration. The store clerk, Dorothy Chen, noticed Marcus had developed a peculiar habit. He would sprinkle the soil around his cabin in intricate patterns, almost like he was creating some sort of ritual circle. She watched him through her kitchen window, which overlooked the hollow, and saw him pacing these patterns every night, muttering to himself. Then came the incident that changed everything. On November 13, 1954, Marcus burst into the general store at closing time, wild-eyed and covered in dirt. He grabbed Dorothy by the shoulders and whispered urgently, "It's happening. The earth is giving them back. Every word I've ever written, it's speaking them back to me, but in voices I don't recognize." Dorothy tried to calm him down, but Marcus was beyond reason. He claimed that when he walked his usual path through the woods, he could hear his own poems being recited by invisible mouths rising from the ground. Not just his voice, but dozens of voices, all speaking his words in perfect unison. "They know every line," he told her, his hands shaking. "Every metaphor, every rhythm. But it's not just repetition. They're improving on them, making them better. And I don't know who they are." The local doctor, James Whitmore, was called to examine Marcus's notes, which I found in the town's historical archives, describe a man suffering from what appeared to be severe auditory hallucinations and paranoid delusions. But Dr. Whitmore also noted something unusual. Marcus could recite poetry with an accuracy and eloquence that seemed almost supernatural. More disturbing still, he was reciting poems that Dr. Whitmore had never heard before. Poems that Marcus claimed the earth had whispered to him in return for his own work. Marcus became increasingly reclusive. He stopped coming to town entirely, and neighbors reported seeing him only at night, always walking the same path through the woods, always carrying his typewriter. The sound of typing could be heard from his cabin at all hours, sometimes continuing for days without stop. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, who lived closest to Marcus, kept a diary during this period. Her entries describe hearing the most beautiful poetry being recited in the woods during her sleepless nights. But when she looked out her window, she saw only Marcus, alone, appearing to have conversations with empty air. According to her diary, the voices were so clear and numerous that she initially thought Marcus was hosting secret gatherings. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came the final chapter of Marcus Thorne's story. On December 21st, the winter solstice, Mrs. Hayes woke to the sound of frantic typing, but this wasn't coming from Marcus's cabin, it was coming from directly beneath her floorboards. She pressed her ear to the ground and heard not just typing, but Marcus's voice, muffled and distant, reciting poetry with an urgency she had never heard before. She called for help, and when the townspeople arrived at Marcus's cabin, they found it empty. His typewriter sat on the kitchen table, a half-finished poem still wound into it. The poem, which was later transcribed by the local sheriff, described a pact between the poet and the earth, a trade of words for sustenance, of creativity for something called the deep listening. But Marcus himself was nowhere to be found. The search party followed footprints that led from his cabin to a clearing about a quarter mile into the woods. There, they discovered something that defied explanation, a perfectly rectangular hole in the ground, exactly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, dug with mathematical precision. At the bottom of the hole lay Marcus's leather satchel and a handwritten note that simply read, "The earth asked for payment. I give myself as collateral for the words I have borrowed." Marcus Thorne's body was never found. The sheriff filled in the hole and marked the area as off limits, but strange things continued to happen. Visitors to the woods reported hearing typing sounds coming from beneath the ground. Others claimed to hear poetry being recited by multiple voices, all speaking in perfect harmony. Dr. Whitmore, fascinated by the case, returned to the site several times over the following months. His private journals, discovered after his death in 1979, contain detailed accounts of his experiences. He wrote of hearing Marcus's voice, along with dozens of others, engaged in what he described as an endless poetry reading beneath the earth. Most disturbing of all, Dr. Whitmore claimed that the voices were creating new poetry, works of such beauty and complexity that he began transcribing them. These transcriptions still exist in his personal papers, and literary scholars have confirmed that they represent some of the most sophisticated poetry ever composed, written in styles that wouldn't emerge in mainstream literature for decades. The cabin remained empty for 5 years, until a young couple from Boston, unfamiliar with the local stories, decided to rent it. They lasted 3 weeks. The woman, Sarah Collins, told reporters that she would wake every night to the sound of her husband reciting poetry in his sleep. But when she tried to wake him, he would continue speaking in a voice that wasn't his own. Her husband, David, claimed no memory of these incidents, but Sarah noticed that he had begun writing poetry during the day, something he had never done before. The poems, she said, were extraordinarily beautiful, but filled with imagery of being buried alive, of speaking from beneath the earth, of trading consciousness for artistic immortality. The Collins fled the cabin after David attempted to dig a hole in their backyard, claiming he needed to return what he had borrowed. Since then, the cabin has remained empty. The town eventually purchased the property to prevent any more incidents, and it sits today exactly as Marcus left it, his typewriter still on the table, the half-finished poem still wound into the roller. But the story doesn't end there. Local teenagers, drawn by the legend, occasionally venture to the cabin on days. Most return with nothing more than stories of creaking floorboards and wind through broken windows. But some have reported more disturbing experiences. They describe hearing the sound of typing coming from beneath the floorboards, and seeing the keys of Marcus's typewriter moving on their own, pecking out poems in the darkness. In 1997, a paranormal investigation team equipped the cabin with recording devices. What they captured has never been publicly released, but team leader Patricia Vance later stated in an interview that they recorded over 47 distinct voices, reciting poetry simultaneously, creating what she described as a chorus of the buried. Most unsettling of all, several of the poems they recorded were later found to match unpublished works by famous poets who had died decades before Marcus Thorne was even born. The case of Marcus Thorne remains one of the most baffling disappearances in Vermont history. Was he a mentally ill man who suffered a complete psychological breakdown? Or did he discover something about the relationship between creativity and the natural world that drove him to make the ultimate sacrifice? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between madness and mystery. What we know for certain is that Marcus Thorne believed the earth was listening to his poetry and speaking back to him, and whether that was delusion or reality, it consumed him entirely. The cabin still stands today, and locals say that on quiet nights, especially during the winter months, you can still hear the sound of typing coming from the woods. Some believe it's just the wind. Others think it's Marcus, still writing, still trading words with the earth that claimed him. But perhaps the most chilling possibility is that Marcus Thorne found exactly what he was looking for: an audience that would listen forever, and a place where his poetry could live eternally. Whispered by voices he would never recognize, rising from soil that remembers every word ever spoken to it. The next time you write a poem or speak your thoughts to an empty landscape, remember Marcus Thorne. Remember that somewhere in Vermont, the earth is still listening, and it just might whisper back.